Good evening. Take a moment to calm yourself. Breathe deeply, and let us listen to the story of a man who defied his ego and accepted the truth of the world. This is the tale of Kazegatana. In the midst of the morning mist that blanketed the Arashino Valley stood a samurai, his long black hair tied neatly and his eyes as sharp as the blade he wielded. He was known as Kazegatana, the Wind Blade. The name was not given lightly. His movements were swift as shadows, and on the battlefield he tore through enemies like a silent storm. But it was not only his skill that earned him respect. It was his character, his unwavering honor, his loyalty to promises, and his devotion to truth above all else, even above men. He was the people's protector, a shadow that appeared whenever justice was under threat. Yet times have changed, and within the proud walls of power, loyalty can become a curse, and truth can be buried beneath cunning politics. Shogun Aritomo, who ruled with a firm yet just hand, placed his full trust in Kazegatana. But behind the grand walls of the castle, an advisor named Benimaru was weaving a sinister plot. With a silver tongue and a false smile, he sowed seeds of political poison, causing the shogun to doubt those closest to him. Benimaru orchestrated a scheme to make it appear as though Kazegatana had leaked military secrets to the rebels. In a single night, the honor Kazegatana had built over years was shattered. He was brought before a sham trial, where every piece of evidence had been fabricated. He did not resist, for to him, honor was more valuable than a futile defense. With his sword unfastened from his waist, he accepted his fate. Exiled as a ronin, without a master, without honor. His days as a ronin felt like a long, silent curse. Kazegatana wandered from town to town, village to village, not just to survive, but in search of work that might offer a flicker of purpose. Yet the world no longer welcomed men like him, not because he was hated or his reputation was known, but because misfortune seemed to shadow his every step. Everywhere he went, it was always too late. Guards had already been chosen. Merchants already had their protectors. Even cowherd positions were filled. He became an aimless drifter, greeted only by drizzle and wary stares. One damp and windy evening, Kazegatana tried his luck in a mountain village called Hinamura. The village chief had posted a job for a warehouse guard, and Kazegatana offered himself. But when he attempted to demonstrate a basic sword technique, his mind wandered and his footing faltered. Whether it was the moss-covered ground or his hollow thoughts, he slipped, his own blade grazing his hand. The wound was small, yet enough to make him stare at his own blood in a daze. He knew it wasn't his body that had weakened, but his spirit that was no longer awake. His will had faded. The village chief turned him away, and that night Kazegatana walked on in silence once more, carrying a fresh wound on his hand and old scars deep in his heart. As dawn touched the quiet village of Okibe, Kazegatana arrived with his hand wrapped in cloth, seeking peace and perhaps a sliver of work. The town was calm, too calm for a samurai like him, but its tea house served a warm drink that soothed the heart. There he was greeted by an old man who looked like an ordinary farmer, unkempt, quiet, and observant to an unsettling degree. The man introduced himself as Kurojiro and offered a drink without much conversation. There was something unusual in the way he held the cup, steady, deliberate, and precise. Kazegatana said little, until Kurojiro finally remarked, You look like a man who has lost his way. I know a place that might need someone like you." His words explained nothing, yet implied so much. Before leaving, Kurojiro patted his shoulder and quietly said, "Meet me tonight. I have a job for you, not an ordinary one." That night, Kazegatana had no idea that this encounter would open a door to a path he never could have imagined. That night, beneath a starless, overcast sky, Kazegatana followed Kurojiro through narrow alleys toward an old, heavily guarded estate. The house belonged to a high-ranking official, though Kazegatana was told neither the man's name nor the reason for their visit. He didn't ask, not out of trust, but because his mind was too hollow to be curious. Kurojiro simply said, "Wait in the bushes by the east gate. Watch. Do nothing." And so Kazegatana waited, crouched in silence among wild grass and the shadows of trees. He watched as Kurojiro moved like a phantom, one step, then gone. His movements were so calm, it was as if he floated. Kazegatana narrowed his eyes, realizing the man was no ordinary farmer. Deep within, an old instinct whispered, "This is no ordinary job." But before he could reflect any further, he heard the soft creak of a wooden door in the distance and saw Kurojiro's shadow slip quietly into the house. Kazegatana waited in silence. The night air was so cold that his breath turned visible, yet his thoughts were even colder than the air around him. He sat with his back against the bushes just outside the eastern gate of the official's residence. Someone whose name he still didn't know. Kurojiro had not returned, and from the outside the house appeared calm. A few guards patrolled the grounds, but none noticed Kazegatana's presence. Soon Kurojiro's shadow re-emerged from behind the stone wall. He moved neither hurriedly nor leisurely. His steps were those of someone who knew every corner of the house. With a subtle wave of his hand, he signaled Kazegatana to follow from a distance. They moved quietly along a narrow path beside a small river until they reached a secluded spot beneath a wooden bridge. There, Kurojiro sat cross-legged on a rock and lit a small pipe. "You saw how I work?" he asked softly. "A thief," Kazegatana replied flatly. Kurojiro chuckled, his voice as smooth as the stream beside them. "It's not stealing if I'm taking back what was already stolen, is it?" he said quietly, gazing up at the dark sky. "This belongs to the people, taken from them by those in power." Kazegatana said nothing. Strangely, the words made sense, or perhaps his heart had become too empty to reject any logic at all. The next day, Kazegatana and Kurojiro walked toward the northern edge of Okibe. There, hidden behind old farmers' homes, stood a long-abandoned warehouse. Inside, Kurojiro revealed something that made Kazegatana narrow his eyes. Not just old maps and documents, but small boxes filled with coins, fine cloth and jewelry, belongings of common folk, seemingly plundered by local officials. Among the piles were also scrolls bearing the imperial seal, some opened, containing orders for rice distribution, troop allocations, and trade contracts. "This world isn't ruled solely by samurai," Kurojiro said, fixing his gaze on Kazegatana, "but by unseen shadows, hands that work in silence." Kazegatana began to realize that what he had witnessed wasn't mere theft, but a hidden web of power and corruption. Kurojiro didn't lay out his intentions plainly, but it was enough for Kazegatana to feel that perhaps the world behind a samurai's honor was far more rotten than he had ever imagined. The next day, Kazegatana and Korojiro walked toward the northern edge of Okibe. There, hidden behind old farmers' homes, stood a long abandoned warehouse. Inside, Korojiro revealed something that made Kazegatana narrow his eyes. Not just old maps and documents, but small boxes filled with coins, fine cloth, and jewelry below. Kurojiro offered him a simple first task: deliver a scroll to an old woman in the neighboring village. No reading, no questions. Kazegatana was almost insulted. He was a samurai, not a courier. But Kurojiro merely looked at him and said, "You can refuse, but you're here because you have nowhere else to be." The words cut deep. In the end, Kazegatana took the scroll and set out early the next morning. The short journey gave him time to think. He arrived at the old woman's home, only to find that she was blind, but she welcomed him as if she had known him all her life. "Kurojiro said you would come," she said, reaching out to touch his face. Her fingers paused gently on his cheek as she whispered, "There's still a light in your eyes, child." After handing her the scroll, Kazegatana returned, and for the first time in years, he received payment: a small sack of rice and 2 silver coins. It wasn't worth much, but to him, it was the price of honor slowly creeping back into his chest. In a short time, Kazegatana became part of the quiet movement Kurojiro had been orchestrating. They held their meetings in the shadows of an old temple, keeping watch over the flow of goods through small ports that seemed to serve as smuggling routes. That night, Kazegatana disguised himself as a night market guard, observing a transaction between foreign men and a local official concealed beneath long drapes of cloth. He saw large crates changing hands, though their contents remained unknown. Some were tightly wrapped in black fabric, others handled with unusual care. From a distance, he heard an unfamiliar tongue, harsh and rapid, a language that sounded like it came from across the sea. "What are they trading?" Kazegatana asked quietly. "It's not time for you to know," Kurojiro replied, somehow already standing beside him. Kazegatana nodded. His instincts were screaming that this was no ordinary smuggling operation, but he didn't yet have enough pieces of the puzzle to understand what was truly unfolding. The following night, Kazegatana and Kurojiro returned to the hidden port to gather more information. But before they could move from their vantage point, the sound of steel boots striking stone echoed from the west. Government samurai troops had arrived in full formation. Their torches blazed brightly, lighting up every corner of the docks and warehouses. The smugglers began to panic, but then something strange happened. The entire port was suddenly plunged into darkness. Lanterns were toppled, curtains drawn down, and then a blast of water from the ships above doused the torches of the samurai forces. In mere seconds, the entire port was swallowed by pitch black. In the suffocating dark came terrifying sounds: the whistle of blades, brief screams, and the thuds of bodies hitting the ground. The samurai had no chance to form a defense. The assault came from all directions, swift and silent. The smugglers struck from the shadows with machetes and daggers, slicing without mercy. Kazegatana and Kurojiro could only hide behind wooden crates, holding their breath as they listened to the massacre they could not see, only hear. Then, silence. All that remained was the sound of dripping blood and the whisper of the sea breeze. Slowly, the port lights came back to life. Lanterns were rehung, casting flickering light on the motionless bodies scattered across the docks. The smugglers began to move casually, believing it was over, but suddenly, one of the fallen samurai leapt to his feet. He tore off his mask and, with a roar of fury, struck down two smugglers in a single motion. Before he could attack again, bang! A deafening crack tore through the night air. A metallic explosion unlike anything Kazagatana had ever heard. The rampaging samurai collapsed instantly, a gaping hole in his chest. Blood sprayed across the crate. Kazagatana froze. That wasn't an arrow. That wasn't a sword. It was the sound of death. From a foreign thing this land did not yet understand. His eyes widened. The world had changed, and he had just witnessed the beginning of an era's collapse with his own eyes. After the sound of the gunshot faded into the silent night, Kazagatana and Kurojiro retreated to the ruins of an old temple on the outskirts of town. Neither of them spoke during the walk. Kazagatana moved like a man unmoored, his steps slow, eyes fixed on the ground. Not out of fear, but because something inside him had collapsed. He had witnessed a massacre. He saw brave samurai, though they were not his comrades, slaughtered like animals in the dark. But what shattered him most was that sound, the cold, swift crack of a foreign weapon. There was no honor in a death like that. No battle, no duel, only a sound, and then silence. Beneath the temple's ancient tree, Kazagatana washed his trembling hands, though they were clean of blood. That weapon, it doesn't belong to this land, he whispered. Kurojiro, sitting cross-legged a short distance away, stared up at the dark sky. But it will become part of it, he said calmly, if we do nothing. Kazagatana gripped the earth beneath him, as if trying to hold on to something real. 2 days after the incident at the port, Kurojiro led Kazagatana to the home of an old artisan who kept secret records. In a hidden basement room, they unrolled ancient scrolls filled with contracts and diplomatic reports that had never been made public. There, for the first time, Kazagatana saw a name that made his blood boil once again: Benimaru. Written in bold black ink, the name appeared repeatedly as the signatory in a series of trade agreements with envoys from the West. Kazagatana read in silence, but his chest burned with fury. He sold the port, he said through clenched teeth. He sold his country. Kurojiro gave a slow nod, and if he isn't stopped, he will become the new face of power. A traitor, praised as a reformer. Kazagatana tightened his fist. For the first time since becoming a Ronin, he felt the urge to fight. Not for a master, but for his homeland. In the nights that followed, Kazagatana and Kurojiro moved silently through the shadows, observing the movements of a new force assembled by Benimaru's followers. These men did not wear traditional armor, but dark uniforms marked with unfamiliar patterns. They carried long boxes wrapped in cloth, and the way they marched, too precise, too synchronized, was nothing like ordinary soldiers. From the rooftops, Kazagatana watched the formation with narrowed eyes. "These are not samurai," he whispered, "nor are they the people's militia." Standing beside him, Kurojiro replied, "They are the soldiers of the future, Benimaru's army." That night, Kazagatana saw with his own eyes that the nation was being reshaped, not with swords, but through a new system. He began to understand that the coming battle would not be sword against sword, but a clash between a way of life and the collapse of a culture. After days of tracking Benimaru's trail, Kazagatana was taken to the ruins of a nobleman's home. a man who had once been a close friend of the shogun. There he found a small altar covered in ash and a scorched, faded portrait. He was silenced for refusing to cooperate, Kurojiro said flatly. Not by enemies, but by his own country, now ruled from the shadows. Kazagatana stood before the altar in silence. In his mind, faces of old comrades resurfaced, along with the memory of the day he swore loyalty to honor. He began to question himself. What does a vow mean when the rulers betray their own people? What is loyalty worth if the one betrayed is the land beneath your feet? In that moment, Kazagatana understood he was no longer just a ronin. He was a remnant of the past, destined to confront the future. Back at their hideout in the bamboo forest, Kurojiro sat cross-legged and unrolled a fresh scroll. "The time has come," he said simply. Kazagatana opened the scroll and found a map of the main castle, the residence of the shogun. Red marks indicated security weak points. "What does this mean?" Kazagatana asked. Kurojiro looked at him with a deep, unwavering gaze. "Benimaru plans to trap the shogun during the autumn banquet. He doesn't know his entire guard has already been replaced by Benimaru's loyalists." Kazagatana fell silent, his mind racing. This was no mere mission. This was treason that could alter the course of history. If he acted, he would be defying the system itself. If he remained still, his homeland would be sold to shadows. In the stillness of the forest, as the wind stirred the bamboo leaves around him, Kazagatana knew he had to choose, and time would not wait for him. That night, the sky was shrouded in black clouds, with no moonlight to guide them. Kazagatana and Kurojiro slipped into the outer grounds of the castle, moving between trees and stones like shadows. The shogun's castle loomed in the distance, grand, fortified, and heavily guarded. But through a narrow point marked on the map, they found an old underground passage once used by the palace gardeners. "We enter through here," Kurojiro whispered. Kazagatana took a deep breath. The scent of damp earth and tangled roots filled his lungs as they crawled into the narrow tunnel. In the darkness, their footsteps were muffled by wet soil. Kazagatana's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of what was at stake. At the end of the tunnel, a faint light glowed. Kurojiro stopped. "From here, we split. You go to the west balcony. I'll take the rear kitchen. If anything happens, you know what to do." Kazagatana nodded. This wasn't just an infiltration. It was the night that would decide the fate of their nation. Inside the castle's grand hall, the shogun sat on a low throne surrounded by nobles and officials. Lantern light flickered across a long table filled with food and sake. In the corner of the room stood Benimaru, draped in formal robes, a faint smile on his lips. He raised a cup, praising a bright future in foreign trade. From the upper balcony, Kazagatana watched with sharp eyes. Below, servants moved about carrying trays of food, but some were not servants at all. He recognized their steps, the hidden precision of a combat formation. His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. As Benimaru stepped closer to the shogun, time seemed to slow. But before Kazagatana could act, The sound of clashing metal rang out from the direction of the kitchen. Shouts erupted, followed by chaos. Kazagatana leapt from the balcony, sword drawn, diving into the heart of the hall. Kazagatana, cloaked in his mysterious ninja garb, lunged toward Benimaru, but was immediately intercepted by two hired guards wielding naginatas. The clash of steel rang through the hall as chaos erupted. The shogun stumbled backward, protected by one of his few remaining loyal bodyguards. Blood began to stain the polished wooden floor as Kazagatana battled three opponents at once. On the far side, Kurojiro emerged from the kitchen, hurling a knife that struck one of the armed servants in the throat. The fight was unlike any Kazagatana had ever faced. These men had no sense of honor, striking from behind, aiming for his legs, even attempting to blind him. With a roar, he slashed one enemy from shoulder to belly, cutting him down. Amid the confusion, the shogun shouted for the guards to seize the two intruders. Benimaru quickly stepped forward, feigning concern, and urged the shogun to retreat to a secure location with his escort. At that moment, the shogun, seeing only chaos, believed the assault in the Great Hall to be the work of traitors. Meanwhile, Benimaru quietly slipped away through a side corridor, moving swiftly to erase any trace of his own betrayal. Despite being pursued by castle guards, Kazagatana and Kurojiro continued their chase after Benimaru, who fled through the castle's hidden corridors. Flames had begun consuming the eastern wing, ignited by a fallen lantern during the earlier clash. Smoke now choked the passageways, making it hard to breathe, harder still to see. Through the thick haze, Kazagatana spotted Benimaru's shadow descending a stone staircase toward a hidden gate. Suddenly, a sharp pop rang out behind them, a small explosion. A Western-made smoke bomb. The pursuing guards began coughing violently, their eyes burning from the chemicals. Kazagatana winced in pain, temporarily blinded and gasping for air. But Kurojiro, still alert thanks to his ninja mask, pulled Kazagatana through the smoke and out into the open air. "He's escaping toward the port!" Kurojiro shouted. Kazagatana stood up, clutching his sword tighter. "Then we chase him, even if it takes us to the ends of the earth." In the now silent harbor, lit only by scattered torchlight, Benimaru climbed aboard a foreign vessel, already prepared to set sail. On its deck stood several armed men, clad in dark uniforms, their weapons gleaming faintly in the firelight. The air was thick with tension. This was no merchant ship. This was an escape. Kazagatana and Kurojiro arrived just minutes too late. From behind stacked wooden crates, they watched the ship begin to drift away from the dock. "If that ship leaves the harbor," Kurojiro murmured, "we lose everything." Kazagatana's jaw clenched as he stared at the rolling waves. "We can't wait. We board that ship tonight." A thin smile tugged at Kurojiro's lips. "Then we become ghosts on the sea." Without hesitation, they crawled to the edge of the dock, slipping silently into the shadows, preparing to infiltrate the ship that would carry them into the final chapter of their country's hidden war. They swam silently beneath the harbor's surface, slipping through the dark waters until they reached the shadowed hull of the ship. With a rope prepared in advance, Kurojiro climbed first, swiftly and silently, then helped Kazagatana onto the deck. Above them, foreign guards patrolled with strange rifles Kazagatana had never seen before, sleek, efficient, and terrifying in their silence. Their speech was foreign, clipped and fast. He understood none of it, but he felt the weight of its meaning. Kurojiro gestured for silence, then moved low between crates. Kazagatana followed, breath steady, heart pounding. They slipped into the cargo hold. There, in the dim lantern light, they saw it. Massive wooden crates stacked high, brimming with firearms, bullets, and barrels of black powder. Kazagatana reached out, brushing his fingers over a cold, unfamiliar barrel. These are not our weapons. Kurojiro's eyes were sharp as a blade. No, they are what Benimaru trades for our homeland. Behind the storage room, Kurojiro discovered a small hidden door concealed beneath a pile of cloth. They carefully opened it and stepped into a secret chamber. Inside, a large table was covered with contract documents, maps of Japan marked with red symbols, and sealed letters bearing the crest of a foreign empire. Kazagatana picked up one of the documents and read it slowly. This is a territorial division plan for after the government falls, he said, voice trembling. Kurojiro added grimly, Benimaru has sold the future of this land for power. We must bring this to the shogun. But before they could leave, the alarm bell rang from the upper deck. The ship's lights flared on, and the sound of rushing footsteps echoed above.
They know we're here,
shouted Kurojiro. Kazagatana quickly grabbed the crucial documents and tied them around his waist. They slipped out of the chamber, but one guard spotted their shadows and shouted. Gunshots rang out, bullets smashing into the wooden crates around them. Kazagatana drew his sword as he ran.
We have to get off this ship before it leaves the harbor.
They sprinted toward the edge of the ship, pursued by 3 armed foreign guards. Kurojiro hurled a shuriken at the floodlight, shattering it and plunging the deck into momentary darkness. Kazagatana slashed down one guard who got too close, but the other 2 opened fire. A bullet narrowly missed Kurojiro. Without hesitation, they leapt off the ship into the cold, black sea, just as a loud explosion echoed behind them. The icy water slammed against their bodies like knives. Clutching the documents tightly, they swam toward the dock.
Kazagatana and Kurojiro managed to climb onto the dock and took cover in the ruins of an old warehouse. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the ravaged harbor. They looked down at the documents, partially soaked, but still intact. Kazagatana gripped them tightly. We have the proof, but we don't have much time. Kurojiro nodded. We must return to the capital before Benimaru erases all traces. A new dawn lit their path. Weary, wounded, and barely awake, they prepared to move, only to hear the sound of clapping echoing from the shadows. It was Benimaru who had been clapping. From the side doors, elite troops armed with firearms emerged, aiming their weapons at Kazagatana. But before a single shot was fired, Kurojiro leapt down from a wooden beam above, hurling a smoke bomb that clouded the entire area in a thick haze. Chaos erupted. Kazagatana dashed into action, slashing through the smoke and dodging bullets with short, explosive movements. He moved like a storm, precise, swift, and deadly. Even against gunfire, Kazagatana proved that the spirit of a samurai could not be pierced by lead. The last of the guards fell. Kazagatana now stood face to face with Benimaru, who held a pistol in his trembling hand. This is a new era, Benimaru said. There's no place for your sword anymore. Kazagatana raised his blade. As long as justice lives, this sword will still be needed. Benimaru fired. Kazagatana leapt, his sword cutting through the air, and in a single strike, the pistol and Benimaru's hand dropped to the ground. Benimaru screamed in pain. Kazagatana stood over him, blood on his cheek, eyes sharp as steel. Benimaru lay on the ground, bleeding but still alive. Eye only wanted power. The world is changing too fast, he gasped. Kazegatana looked down at him. And you sacrificed your people for it. Without a change in expression, he raised his sword and beheaded Benimaru. The sky began to change colors as dawn broke. The city slowly returned to its calm rhythm, the people unaware that the course of history had shifted the night before. The shogun received a package. Inside were Benimaru's blood-stained garments and documents revealing his betrayal. The shogun was puzzled. There was no name, no clue as to who had exposed it all. Time passed. Kurojiro now lived a quiet life as a farmer, far from shadows and blades. As for Kazegatana, after learning of distant lands across the sea, he left his country, not out of fear of being called a traitor, nor for the glory of being named a hero. He simply knew his duty to the nation was done.